Hello, everybody. My name is Uffa Jensen. I'm a professor for the study of anti-Semitism at the Center for the Study of and Research on Anti-Semitism at the Technical University in Berlin. By training, I'm a historian, but since anti-Semitism is obviously also a very contemporary issue, I also work on contemporary stuff and I gave the lecture and we want to discuss some of the questions that we couldn't discuss at the evening.
And I also welcome Carl-Emil Vogt. Carl-Emil?
Hello, my name is Carl-Emil Vogt. I am also an historian working at the Holocaust Center here in Oslo. And I am joining the seminar just to take your questions and try and pick out a few of them to ask to Uffa and also Claudia. So please ask questions in the chat. We will not answer them in the chat, but I will pick out a few good ones and important ones and give them further to Claudia and Uffa.
Thank you, Carl-Emil. So just about the structure we have chosen. We have collected all the questions and have clustered them in different categories and different themes, and you also see them in the chat here. They will be visible during the entire session, and we will talk us through them. So the first one is anti-Semitism versus criticism of Israeli politics. The second one is the historical context and contemporary implications. The third one is understanding anti-Semitism and Zionism. And the fourth is about the implications of media and public perception. So let's start with the first cluster, Uffa. And the first question here picks up on your lecture and one important point you made during your lecture, which is the distinction between criticism of Israel, hostility against Israel, and anti-Semitism. So the question here is, what kind of practical consequences do these distinctions have?
Yeah, well, the first practical consequence is that we need to look at incidences of anti-Semitism in their context where they appear very carefully, and we have to try to make distinctions, although that is sometimes difficult, also sometimes with limited context and knowledge about the context. But what I propose is not just to distinguish between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, which is often the two sides that are discussed in broad terms, and then there is a fight if criticism can actually or must be viewed mostly as anti-Semitism, or if anti-Semitism is only a small part. I would like to introduce a third element, which I think runs the conflict that we're actually facing, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to a large degree. After all, this is a nationalist conflict over resources, land, and rights. And this kind of conflict that is a nationalistic one creates hostility as well, a kind of hostility that can be very harsh. Just to remind people, a comparison to the Russian and Ukrainian war currently, which also creates nationalist hatred on both sides. So we kind of need to distinguish this nationalism. And I think it's one of the practical consequences when you do this is we tend to then take the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, much more serious in itself as a problem. And we can then say, well, these are emotions, these are attacks, these are forms of hostility that relate to the conflict, and not so much to an anti-Semitic intention, although that can also sometimes, that can also, of course, exist. So we're not in the danger of conflating everything. That's at least my hope with this distinction. And one further point is that I think I don't propose that we can solve the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that easily. Obviously, it's a very complex conflict. But if both sides can describe the other side as thoroughly anti-Semitic or as thoroughly racist, which is the intention, or these intention at least exist on both sides, then the position of the partners in this conflict are devalued. They're undermined, they're threatened, they're not legitimate. If you call your opponent anti-Semitic, you're basically saying nothing about your position is legitimate. So the conflict cannot be solved in that way because you cannot really see the other side. And I think that's also a serious problem, not just for evaluating anti-Semitism, but for actually addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So that would be one practical consequence for me as well, would be that we can more sensitively and sensible relate statements that we want to evaluate to the conflict as well as to anti-Semitism.
A follow-up question, of course, which also came in our session is this really possible to keep hostility and anti-Semitism from each other? Is there a kind of risk to conflate these, and especially when hostility tips over to hate?
Well, it's very difficult. It is difficult. And also I would even argue that the participants in this conflict, the Israeli side, but also the Palestinian side, both are invoking constantly anti-Semitism as well as racism to justify their own cause. So it becomes more problematic. The conflict itself tends to have a language of racism and anti-Semitism embedded in it, and that tends to make it more difficult to solve the problem, but also it raises the level of aggression on both sides in many ways. So I agree that it's very difficult to take things apart, and in some practical situations that we sometimes have in front of us, it is almost impossible to dissect what kind of hatred we have. But I think conceptually we nevertheless need to do that, because otherwise we are conflating from the start. Maybe we end up not being able to dissect things, but we shouldn't conflate from the start, in my view.
And there were several questions related to that blurry lines, but also to the instrumentalization. Several questions asked about the role of the Israeli government in this, and if in your evaluation the Israeli government is a part of that problem in purposefully applying a too broad definition. And of course there were concrete examples given, for example, with regard to the accusations against the UN and the rulings of ICJ and ICC. Maybe you can say something about that complex.
I think both sides, it makes sense for them. They are involved in a very terrible conflict, and it's a very tough confrontation. So your arguments against the other side tend to become more aggressive in some ways over time, and more frustration and more anger. So I see this on the Israeli side, but I also see this on the Palestinian side in many ways. The allegation of racism and anti-Semitism take part, but happen. And as I said, it's also an attempt to undermine and devalue the other side, to basically say you have no right to even a proper argument. So the Israeli government, yes, especially this current government is very right-wing, one of the most right-wing governments in Israeli history, or maybe the most right-wing government. So yes, there are clearly tendencies to call everything anti-Semitic. I'm not saying that all of Israel does this. I'm not saying that all of the political spectrum does this, but there is on the right, especially, a clear tendency to use anti-Semitism to promote Israeli perspective on the conflict, but also in general, and that is problematic. Also because the intentions of the Israeli government or of the Palestinian side, for example, to call something racist or anti-Semitic may not be interested very much in what our situation in Europe is, or what situations outside of in the Western world are. So, when the Israeli government calls something anti-Semitic, it's related often to Israeli situations and Israeli-related forms of criticism or hatred. But we have many other forms in European societies. So European societies, if you only take that yardstick, you will leave out large parts of our problems with anti-Semitism and racism, especially on the right, which especially the current right-wing government in Israel does not care much about. And regarding the resolutions, because that's one important topic, there have been resolutions in the past that I view as problematic. The resolution from 1975, which calls Zionism a form of racism, was clearly wrong, and I would say anti-Semitic in its intention, but it has been revoked in 1991. We shouldn't forget that. But other cases of the UN are, I think, at least we have to look at that. If the ICC says, the ICG says, the International Court of Justice, that the war in Gaza, for example, could amount to a genocide, then we, I think, have to look at this evaluation and look at the definition, and they're mainly discussing, I think, the case of starvation and famine that resulted from the war in Gaza. And I understand that Israelis find that a terrible accusation, but at the same time, as a matter of international law, I think it's, we have to address these issues in order for international law to be effective. So I wouldn't call that necessarily anti-Semitic. And we haven't even seen any court case related to this. So we don't. We only have seen the accusation and the beginning of the proceedings. So we don't know the result yet. And I wouldn't just go about saying that all of this has an anti-Semitic intention.
These distinctions are, of course, very important. So a follow-up question could be this discourse on genocide, the accusations, which in fact came very early. Do you have any evaluation to which extent the position you now say it needs to be possible to discuss this, to get it evaluated, but also how it can become a part of a problematic discourse and maybe related to the phenomenon of demonization? Yeah,
I mean, in general, the war had not even started, and people were already using the word genocide. And I mean, I'm with regard to what will happen in Gaza. So I've found that problematic. But we have to look at the actual cases. What is argued by the ICG, and they argue for deliberate attempts of starvation, and that it qualifies as one. This is in the genocide definition. However this result will be, I have not the tools and not the information to assess it. But there is also, of course, how should we call this? A political. It's too serious to call it a game, but a kind of a game of the labels. How do we call this? If we can call this a genocide, and it may amount to one, but if we can call this a genocide, then the claim of the Israeli side that they do this to prevent another Holocaust may be undermined. So there is a kind of victim competition going on here that is in itself sometimes problematic. At the same time, of course, what has happened in Gaza, to all accounts that we has been terrible and inhumane in all respects. So that people want to call this a genocide, and now given the threat of the current Trump government to depopulize Gaza and to send the Palestinians somewhere else, which reminds us of the Nakba. Of course, for Palestinians, this sounds like a repeat of the Nakba and the forced expulsion of Palestinians from the territory. So there is not just, from a Palestinian perspective, there is not just something that happened in the past. There is not just what happens in the war, with the war in Gaza, but there's the threat of expulsion. From a Jewish point of view, much of these discussions sound like denying the Holocaust and denying the importance of the Holocaust, because they hear, oh, you want to call this a genocide while this is a legitimate war. So what I'm trying to say is there's the one and the factual evaluation, but at the same time, I think there is a politicized discussion going on of victim blaming, of victim competition, which we cannot easily stop. And the two, of course, then relate to each other. So most Israelis are very upset about the charge of genocide, but Palestinians are also saying, why do you keep on talking about the Holocaust? Look at what happens to us. So that's part of the problem, I think.
So it's necessary to distinct the discussion, exploration about, and according to international law, what is going on the ground, and to which extent and when and if can it qualify, and at the same time to acknowledge that there is always, this is a part of a rhetoric and a question of delegitimizing the other position too. Which brings us, I look at my communication with Karl Emil, and it doesn't seem that we have got some extra questions to that topic. So I think we can go on, move to the next topic, which you basically have touched upon, which is the context and the historical references, because we received several questions related to that, and one particular question is related to the comparisons here, that Israel is compared to Nazi Germany, and the warfare in Gaza is related to the Holocaust and so on, and your evaluation about when lines to anti-Semitism are crossed, and if this is crossing lines.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
The comparisons between like Israel and Nazi Germany and what's going on in Gaza is the same as the Holocaust and so on.
Yeah, I mean, many of these comparisons are problematic. Of course, they want to attack the other side, but they're also problematic because they often don't seem to understand the nature of the Holocaust. I'm not a specialist on the history of the Holocaust, but I've worked at times quite intensively on this, and the amount of genocidal violence that we face in the Holocaust is very often not acknowledged in these kinds of usage of the Holocaust as a reference. It was a terrible state-sponsored and state-directed genocide which killed 6 million people, and all over Europe it took place with many collaborators. So with an amazing amount, and that is often not seen, with an amazing and terrible amount of violence, of direct face-to-face violence. And when we just refer to this as a case in our rhetoric, we often don't acknowledge this. So I think there is this problem of taking it as just a form of accusation, and then but there are even problematic comparisons between the Holocaust, I think, and what happened in Gaza, or what happened with the Hamas attack. Is this the same? Many Israelis would relate it that way, but I would still argue that on matters of scale, but also matters of the sheer scale of things, the sheer magnitude of the Holocaust is not really, it cannot be easily rectified or compared to this incident, as terrible as it is. But the way our memory works, the way Israeli memory works, the way Jewish memory works, but also European memory works, this is the point of reference for our discussion. And sometimes I don't think that helps us much, because it also clouds our arguments in some ways. And practically, we scholars on anti-Semitism often ask people if they conflate what happens to the Palestinians with the Nazi onslaught on Jews. And we see this as an indicator for anti-Semitism. So there was a large consensus among researchers on anti-Semitism that it is a sign of anti-Semitic intention if you want to relate anything that happens in Israel with regard to the Palestinians, as bad as this might be, to the Holocaust and the Nazi treatment of Jews in the Third Reich. So I would say that this is often very problematic. Sometimes people don't really know what they're relating to, what you know, the knowledge of anti-Semit of the Nazi Holocaust is limited in some cases, but it is often a very problematic argument.
At the same time, we established the distinction between anti-Semitism as something which is conscious and intentional, and something which can carry very problematic meaning without being purposeful. And even if not aware of this, like in the effect, it can be have a very problematic effect, especially when you talk about the emotional dimension related to a minority which is traumatized and re-traumatized by events like 7th of October.
Yes, and also I think, you know, it's a matter of how our memory works. I mean, for us, for Europeans and even worldwide, the Holocaust stands as the most outrageous crime in history. So if you see something outrageous, truly outrageous, you relate this to the model of the Holocaust in some ways. If this is historically correct, for me, it's a completely other different question. But this is how we often perceive crimes, and especially if they involve Jews or Israelis in this case. So yes, this is the point of reference, but it's not often a very helpful one. And it might not necessarily be the conscious one. As you said, it can often be, okay, well, this looks to me like what I've seen in history books. And then it's not a very thorough argument, but it seems to work in our memory.
We have one more question here related to questions of contextualizations and also historical references, which is about the problem that it seems that Israel sometimes is singled out. There is much more focus and much more negative focus, and portraying the Palestinian-Israel conflict as much more terrible than anything else, which also again is related to this use of superlatives in comparison, genocide, apartheid, and so on. Which I think this question points a little bit to this questions of double standards. Is there something anti-Semitic, or what is problematic, if one could describe the situation like that?
I think there can be definitely double standards. Some of the obsession, especially in segments of the left, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Not just now when we just went through a terrible war and the Hamas attacks, but in general, the fascination, but also the sort of concentration on this issue, on this conflict, can be irritating. At the same time, I think we can understand this. There are other terrible conflicts on the planet. I just mentioned the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, and there's a long history to this as well, involving a lot of European history as well, and that's very close for many of us, of course. But take the conflict about Tibet and China. That's very far away, and we're not really reporting much on this. We don't know much about this. We don't hear much about this, and maybe it's over, I don't know. But there are other conflicts on the world, and there have been conflicts which we're much less interested in. But I don't think that is so terribly difficult to understand. The Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict also has a few special aspects that other conflicts don't tend to have. There is, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is really a conflict that is about the same territory and the control and sovereignty in this territory. And that is difficult to see with other conflicts. But even more so, this is intensely related to European history, to our history. It's related to the history of Nazism. It's related to the history of anti-Semitism, which forced Jews to leave Europe for Palestine and other places. But it's also related to colonialism. It's also related to British history and the Mandate period. So it's very intrinsically intertwined with our own history. And in that way, it speaks to us more than maybe the conflict in Tibet or other conflicts in Sri Lanka, for example, other conflicts that may be very terrible as well, or I'm sure they are, but we're not discussing this as much. And there is another element. There are diaspora communities living among us that are directly related to the conflict. May they be Palestinian or Muslim or Arab, or may they be Jewish. They sort of, I'm not saying that they import the conflict, that's not the case, but they are involved. So our societies are more involved in that conflict in many ways. And the final thing is that it's a great conflict for the media to cover. It's very prominent in international media because it's very accessible conflict. You know, it might be very hard to get coverage from Tibet or from Sri Lanka, but it's not hard to cover the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, it is now because you cannot enter Gaza, but it has not been problematic to do this over the past years. So it's prominent in our history, but it's also prominent in our media coverage from all sides. So in that way, yes, there are double standards, but it's also true that we're really directly involved in the conflict.
We will come back to that media question in a while, but a very important follow-up question here, of course, is in the formulation of this question here that okay, we can understand there is a stronger focus on that conflict than others, but that in that way also Israel can be portrayed as more terrible than any other regime in the world or any other yeah. So the question here again is if you cannot use a double standard in kinds of quantity. Okay, you can understand there are reasons why, but what's about the quality? Maybe again, this effects which that can have in the discourse and in the portrayal and idea, which then can link to long-standing ideas about evil and absolute evil.
Yeah. I think that is, of course, true as well. The long history of anti-Semitism does play into the kind of ideas that we have about the conflict. So it does raise the question. You know, some portrayal of Israel as evil play with this kind of long-standing anti-Semitic idea of Jewish conspiracy and evil. I have no doubt about this. But at the same time, the fact that the conflict itself is very important to us is understandable, I think. And I don't think actually that helps the conflict. The conflict does not. The conflict gets more difficult to solve because more and more people are involved. I don't think that actually helps. Quite often. But of course, notions of anti-Semitism play into this and can play into this, but also notions of racism, you know, portrayal of Palestinians as evil can also have racist connotations, which go back to concepts of the Oriental Arabs, the Orientalist figures in history. So there is a lot that can be activated if we look at the conflict, which we shouldn't activate, but we often do, and that's where the problems, at least that's where the problem starts.
During the event a week ago, we came to that conclusion about the necessity to reflect and to be self-reflective. So it seems here that again it's a distinction, not the quantity of the interest or the focus is in itself necessarily a problem, but as you called it an obsession, where again this emotional dimension comes in the picture. And that in the moment when this focus is so strong and it is so emotionalized that the pitfalls are lingering.
Yeah. I think that is true. We are often also, because we're involved, because it's part of our own history, of anti-Semitism, our history of colonialism, we're also emotionally involved. Europeans are, not just Jews and not just Palestinians, but Europeans are. And that's why we sometimes then use images that are questionable and problematic, that come from other sources in our history, that come from anti-Semitic sources, and that we then mobilize to maybe even understand the conflict, or at least to take sides, and that is definitely problematic. And you mentioned an important point, that we should watch our sort of concepts and language, right? We should be aware of what language we use. And in the talk, I gave the example of, people might discuss that the fact that the terrible fact that the Israeli army has killed children in the conflict, in the war on Gaza. I don't see anybody who doubts that children were killed in the process of the bombing of Gaza. But if you can talk about this, I think, and you can criticize this, and you can be angry about this even. But if you use words like, the bloodthirsty Israeli soldiers, for example, then it starts to have a different tone. Then it starts to come from somewhere else. Then it starts to come from the long history of associating Jews, the killing of children, and the thrive for blood. And that is then starts to be problematic. So we need to, in our talk, somebody, I think it was Olaf, who said we need to discuss microaggressions in our language. And that is one case, I think, where we should be aware of what's the terminology that we're using. And also, when I distinguish these three elements, you can be critical. Maybe some people want to be hostile because for nationalism reasons. I'm not saying that this is nice. I don't like it. I will argue against it. But wars happen, conflicts happen, unfortunately, and people will be hostile. But what is not possible and what is not okay is to go into the territory of anti-Semitism and justify your anger against the other side with that tradition. And that works the other way for racism and the vilification of Palestinians that also takes place.
I have a look at the chat, and Carl-Emil doesn't seem that we have received any further question or any question on this topic either, which means I move on, and which I think we have been touching upon. Carl-Emil just says we have received a question, so please, Carl-Emil, share it with us.
I will. We have received a question. Just 1 minute. It relates to the role of the United States. Could the role in this conflict of the United States also be an important factor in triggering attention and obsession, perhaps? At least in the Norwegian context, the role of the US in wars, Vietnam, Iraq, etc., triggers a lot of emotions and protest, which are legitimate and important. The US is and portrays itself as the protector of the rules-based order. So there is the sense of double standards, but also the fact that the US is an allied country of ours and we care about and can influence its behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on sort of the US foreign policy and with regard to Israel, but I think it's quite obvious to say that the different administrations over time had very different US presidential administrations over time had very different perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But overall, they stick to overall a pro-Israeli position, and believed Israelis to be Israel to be the main partner in the region, the partner of the West. In that tradition, the recent administration, the Biden administration, has has supported Israel in terms of military support, but also in terms of political support. And I understand why people are very critical of this, also in light of the war in Afghanistan, the Iraq war. All of these seem to be wars, or can be portrayed as wars, against Arab nations or Islamic countries, and that then seems to be there seems to be an unbalance in many ways. So I do understand this. I don't know what the current government, the current government is all mixed up in some ways on this. It looks like the Trump administration will support Israel, but I'm not so sure, actually. The Israelis are also very worried about a potential Trump being a potential game changer. It seems to be that Trump, with his Gaza plan as real estate, seems to be all for a right-wing vision of the Israeli politics. But it's very complicated, and Trump is very mixed up, it seems to me, about what to do, because he also doesn't want to spend more money and more military support, it seems, and focus more on American policy. So America has definitely taken has taken in the recent confrontation a very pro-Israel position, I would say, and it hasn't done this in the past in the same way. The Obama administration, for example, was anything but the friends of Netanyahu. So it can change, but the interpretation of the Americans is basically that they think they should support Israel, and I understand when people don't like this because they think it's not helping the conflict.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl-Emil. The question, the section we are now entering is related to the interrelatedness between Zionism, anti-Zionism, and antisemitism. And we received one question which also refers first to the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition on anti-Semitism, which states that denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of the State of Israel is racist. You mentioned that this was part of that UN declaration, which was revised, but that this denial of right to self-determination is anti-Semitism. And so the question here is if anti-Zionism as a position that says there should not be a Jewish state, if this by definition is anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I mean, I think the IRA, the perspective of the IRA and most of the advocates of the IRA would say so. Yes, that most forms of anti-Zionism, or virtually all forms of anti-Zionism, are anti-Semitic. Well, first of all, I would say about this that, I know many Jews who are anti-Zionist because they don't support this form of Jewish nationalism or any other form of nationalism. They're against forms of nationalism, and Jewish nationalism, Zionism is a Jewish nationalist project. So now we could say that these Jews are then anti-Semitic themselves, and I have colleagues who do that, but I find that very irritating, an irritating use of the word and the category of anti-Semitism. So I would caution to do that, and to basically understand that there is internal Jewish dissent, and quite substantial, internal Jewish dissent in the US, but also in many European countries, and also here in Germany on these issues. We shouldn't then go about calling all of this anti-Semitic. That would, I think, be a problematic use of the category. But let's also look at, of course, non-Jewish anti-Zionism that exists. There is a right-wing version, there is a left-wing version, sometimes using also arguments that one should not be nationalistic, that nationalism was a wrong historical development anyway. And I understand these historical arguments, and I think they have some truth to it when you look at the problems that nationalism has created in European histories. It took us a long time to overcome the perils of nationalism. But there is also nationalism exists because there are reasons for it. The right to self-determination is a very important, for groups, is a very important aspect. And so in that way, I would always argue with my colleagues who are anti-nationalist and thus are sometimes anti-Zionists. And we can also, of course, question, a more detailed discussion then would be, what should the nature of the Israeli state should be like? Now it's a democratic state, that's the one element, and it's a Jewish state. And there, at least most people, or many people, say that there is a tension between the two. The state is either Jewish or democratic. Because, what's the situation of the Palestinian minority living in Israel? Yes, they have the right to vote, but there are also problems. See the nationalism, the national law. But there are also the problem if the West Bank and maybe even Gaza become part of Israel in the future, what to do with the minority? That's not a minority, actually. That's about 40% of the population. The Palestinian population would then, I think, be about 40%. So what's the future of this state? Will it be a Jewish state and a less democratic one? Will it be a democratic state and a less Jewish one? Will it be a confederation? Whatever your ideas are there, and they are all discussed, a binational state, there are all these concepts. I don't think that it's necessarily anti-Semitic to argue, for example, for a confederation or a binational state. I don't see it. I don't see how this will happen in the near future. But the argument itself, I don't see it as anti-Zionist. I see it as a legitimate attempt to solve the terrible problem of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict over land and rights.
Many people would argue that in a world which is organized in nation states, why should there not just be one Jewish nation state? And if the denial of this only single Jewish nation state then implicit is anti-Jewish and by that anti-Semitic, what do you think about that?
I understand that argument, and there is also, take it from another perspective. If you're a Jewish person living in Europe and you see the current rise of right-wing radicalism and authoritarian regimes, and sometimes quite extreme ones, look at Hungary, look at the Alternative for Germany in Germany, these are really very right-wing radical movements, and who knows, they may come to power quite soon. So what are you going to do as a Jewish person then? Do you have to flee? Do you have to leave? Maybe. So Jews are then, for them, from that perspective, Israel seems like a security net and something that they feel threatened when this is under attack. So I see this, but at the same time, Palestinians also have a right for self-determination. They have lived in this part of the globe for centuries, and that's their home. They don't want to be expelled from it, but they also want to have political rights. They want to have a state on their own, as far as we know. So what are we going to do about that? And in order to solve this, I can only foresee a binational or a confederation or something, but I don't think it's realistic in any way currently. But that's the problem that we need to solve. Yeah, you can go. I mean, apparently, some people suggest that the Palestinians just need to be kicked out, but that would amount, I fear, that would amount to bloodshed and possible, again, to a Nakba and to violence. So the Trump Gaza plan is a recipe for disaster, and that cannot be the solution that we would argue for. We need to argue for a democratic solution that the two sides can live with and have their sovereignty in some ways.
The synagogue in Oslo, they are a Zionist community. So it's not a community all Jews, but yeah, and if they are defining themselves as Zionists, and we have slogans like "No Zionists in our street," which is appropriated from the anti-fascist slogan "No Nazis in our street." The question here is because you mentioned also codes. Is then anti-Zionist a code, or Zionist a code for Jew, and anti-Zionist a code for anti-Semitism?
Well, I think, as I said, when you asked me for the first question about anti-Zionism, I answered more broadly. I answered with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is one perspective and one important one. So if somebody says I'm an anti-Zionist and relates this to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and his perspective on this, then I can, argue with that. But if people switch the topic, and now you are referring to the streets of Norway, for example, and the people are shouting "No Zionists in our streets," for example, that is. And you're referring to the Norwegian Jewish community. That's a different attack. That's an attack against the against Jewish members living in the diaspora, Jewish Norwegians or Jewish Germans, and I think that is an entirely different business, and there it gets very quickly problematic. First of all, you're assuming they're all Zionists, so you come up with a collectivizing category. You all Jews are like one, right? And that's already, as we know from also the history and the study of racism, that's the first step towards a racist and anti-Semitic concept, when you collectivize individuals into being a coherent mass of people with one intention. So. And as I said, it also blocks out what I described earlier, that, some Jews worry about European societies, and they have always thought, okay, if something goes wrong here, I could go maybe over there. I could go to Israel. And that you completely ignore if you just call them Zionists. You ignore that there may be reasons why Jews are afraid about living in the countries in Europe, or now even in the US. I mean, anti-Semitism has risen also in the United States. So no Zionism in our street quickly gets problematic and anti-Semitic, I would argue. The same is true if you organize, and I said this already in my lecture. If you organize a demonstration, let's say about what happens in Gaza, and you want to protest, the question is how you protest as well, and how angry, and what slogans, etc., etc. But if you do this in front of an Israeli embassy, I would say, yeah, well, that shows that you're relating this to the Israeli situation, obviously. But if you change this and you go to the let's say Oslo synagogue, and you do the demonstration there, then it addresses Jews and not Israel or Israelis, and they're not the same, and we shouldn't conflate them. And one element of anti-Semitism is precisely this conflation of as if all Jews are Zionist, as if all Jews think alike, if all Jews act like a collective to protect Israel or to support even just Netanyahu's policy. I think that's problematic.
Collectivization is a problem. Here I get related to that. I also got the question, what about this idea that Jews should denounce Israel? That why can't you just be critical to what's going on there? If this is basically, you have answered to that, but maybe you can comment on that one too.
Yeah, I think it's to ask Jews as Jews to do something starts quickly. Is problematic. If you ask even Israelis, because I mean, I know a lot of Israelis who live here and who live here because they don't want to live in Israel under Netanyahu, for example, or Netanyahu government. So if I address them and say, what are you doing in Israel with the Palestinians? They're not doing it. They're here. Why do I say this? Why do I address them in this way? But if I speak to a member of the embassy or spokesperson of the Israeli government, then maybe I can address them with critical questions. I certainly can address them with critical questions. I would say so. So it depends whom you're talking to, and also there is, as I said, there is a tendency to collectivize. If you ask Jews or the Jewish community or all Jews of Norway to denounce Zionism, I think that is a anti-Semitic or quickly anti-Semitic problem there.
I look at my chat and obviously no question has come, so I stay a little bit in this thematic section, and you were focusing on it's a conflict, it's a territorial conflict, it's a conflict about national sovereignty and so on, and here we got several versions of the question related to this slogan "From the River to the Sea," which obviously in Germany is officially regarded and treated as a problematic statement, anti-Semitic statement, but which maybe deserves some further consideration. Could you share some ideas about that?
I mean, first of all, From the River to the Sea has a long history. The first uses that we know of are actually not from Palestinians, are from Israeli Zionists. So the early Zionist movement used the term "from the river to the sea" to describe what they saw future Israel or the state should actually look like, to include the West Bank, for example. These are, groups that propagate a greater Israel theory, and they use these terms. So from the river to the sea, there is an Israeli version of this. And actually one court in Germany decided that this is not anti-Semitic or problematic. which I find very interesting, because why is that not problematic? That this use of the terminology. But the German Interior Ministry decided after the 7th of October and the attack of Hamas that using from the river to the sea, and specifically they used only this, so from the river to the sea, as a sign of support of Hamas. First of all, historically, that's wrong. I remember the term from the 1980s when the Hamas was very insignificant. So it has been used a lot by other Palestinian groups. So it's not a sign of Hamas, but our Interior Ministry decided that. And I'm obviously critical of it. And in my mind, it also matters what comes next. You can say from the river to the sea, but then what follows? Some groups are at demonstrations in Berlin are shouting, from the river to the sea, we demand equality. There's nothing anti-Semitic in this. There are all kinds of more creative uses now of from the river to the sea to avoid police arrest on demonstrations. But there's also really, even if you say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, I would argue that in probably, 95%, the intention behind this is problematic and probably anti-Semitic. But I can also imagine it. I would ask the people to describe their future vision of Palestine. It could be a confederation called Palestine. As I said, I don't see this as realistic, but then it's a version that is maybe a peaceful form of collaboration. I understand, and this is the final point about this, I understand that for an Israeli ear, for most Israelis, these kinds of uses are outrageous and wrong, and I understand that they want to call them anti-Semitic. I understand that, and I understand the logic. But still, if you're now pursuing people and maybe potentially even take them to court for using these slogans, we have to be very precise in what do we know about the actual use. And if somebody says from the river to the sea, I demand equality, I don't see how you can describe this as anti-Semitic. So it depends on how you use it and who uses it. As I said, there have been cases of Zionist Israelis, or of Israelis using it in Germany to claim that all of the territory, including the West Bank and Gaza, should be Israeli and should be under the control of Israel. So then I would say that is problematic on another level. But can we call this anti-Semitic? No, it makes no sense. So so it depends on what people are saying and why and how. But it is often used as an anti-Semitic slogan. Yeah, definitely.
So we again reach the conclusion that we need to ask further questions. Not to only on the face of it say, okay, now we define this as anti-Semitic, but that there is a probability, a likeliness that it might be problematic. So we need to explore context, expression, and I think we discussed this before. Something which is here in our Norwegian context also very relevant is the visual element, that the slogan often is followed by visualizations which, for example, show the entire map in Palestinian colors, which then, of course, is a very explicit idea of what follows or what is related, what claim is made by the slogan.
Yes, and I would see that as problematic, because that does, both groups have a right to sovereignty and a right for self-determination. And if you put this under one flag, may it be the Israeli or the Palestinian flag, you are implicitly or and even to some way explicitly denying the right of existence to one group. And I don't think that you should be doing this. And I would, yeah, that is problematic. It's either racist and anti-Palestinian, or it's and calling for their expulsion, or it's anti-Semitic, calling for the Jewish state to cease to exist and to expel Jews from the territory, potentially.
I think we moved to the last section or theme, because here now we enter the question of media. And this, of course, is interesting because we move from this single expressions, words, concepts, where are gray zones, red lines, and so on, to a basically bigger picture. And this is like a discourse, like how can... So we received several questions which were related to the assumption that the Norwegian media have a very one-sided portrayal of the conflict, very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, very hostile, negative to Israeli warfare, and so on. So the question is, can this kind of media coverage be given that it would be that one-sided? Could it be called anti-Semitic? And of course, it's very difficult for you to answer questions about Norwegian media coverage. But when we prepared this conversation, you had some very interesting reflections on the role of media. So maybe you could share these reflections.
I think, yeah, the media is, of course, and it's shaped by many ideas about our societies, our respective societies, and is shaped by the interests of our respective societies. And as you said, I don't read Norwegian. I don't know the details of the discussion in Norway, but I do know how different European societies have reacted to 7th of October, to the Hamas attack, but also to the war in Gaza, and repeatedly have put this into very different contexts. So if you look at the German debate, which tends to be quite pro-Israeli in comparison to the Norway. So it's a case. So it seems to it seems to be an outcome of different sensitivities, which also the journalists who write these texts that are then published in the media are affected by. So an interpretation of the German Nazi past and the Holocaust shapes how German journalists approach these issues, as I think also the Norway's situation is shaped by the Norwegian past in ways that I don't necessarily understand myself, so I have to excuse myself. But if you look at, for example, the UK situation in the United Kingdom, in England, it's clear that the English perspective on much of these debates is shaped by the colonial past, and the fact that the British Mandate period was shaping the conflict in many ways, and in mostly negative ways. So they much of what the perspective in the media in England, for example, is shaped by the past. So in that way, it's very interesting. If I give the same talk in different countries, sometimes the reaction is understandably different in some ways. But the media is also, of course, is in itself an interesting factor in this. It is shaped by not just the historical interest, but also by political assessments. And the journalists in them sometimes feel also a quite substantial amount of insecurity, to be honest. They are confused about the conflict. How do you react to this? How do you write about this? How do you, what kind of story do you make out of it? And so they also often, especially in a very contested situation, pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, they often try to take sides, or it's difficult for them to maneuver in this. So I think it has been a very stressful time also for many of the editorial boards of the media, of many of the newspapers. And in fact, I know this from German debates in the newspaper journal and in journals. So I think the media plays a role in itself and how it shapes our understanding also. And I do think, yes, there are very substantial national difference. Thus, we as the population also focus almost necessarily on different things because they are reported to us in different ways. At the same time, in Germany, although I would say in comparison to other countries, Germany's position overall in much of the media was quite pro-Israeli in comparison. The Jewish community doesn't feel that way. They often complain about the one-sidedness. I was just reading an interview with the editor of Jüdische Allgemeine, the major Jewish journal in Germany, and he complained precisely about this. And he actually, the impression I got from his account today was very different from my account. So for him, it was not like I would describe it. But I also would argue probably, and I don't know this, but from conversations with you and others, I also had the impression that even Palestinians in Norway would say it's not in our favor, it's not enough. So there is also a tendency of these diaspora groups to ask for more solidarity from the politicians, but also from the media. And that is understandable, I think, because they suffer and they see the pain and they are affected by it directly, but they also don't always see the particular approach that different countries make to do to this. And I if I would live in Norway, I would probably say different things from what I'm saying here and criticizing here, because I would be faced with a different kind of media landscape, and that shapes me and my work. So if I travel somewhere else, I don't put on a different hat, but I kind of have to think about what's the situation here.
What I think is interesting, and which connects again to a point in your lecture about the different emotional entry points, like you highlighted, it's not only minorities which are in a way especially hit by that and also traumatized by the events, but also the majority which seemingly is not so involved, that it's important to reflect upon how are we also emotionally with our identifications involved due to, for example, the historical framings here. And I think for the question about the media, it would be a very interesting topic for training for journalists, for example, to be self-reflective about, like, when you try to represent and document on this objectively, what might be informing framings, references, and also biases. So I think this not only focusing on the minorities, but also the majority, I think is very inspiring here to that topic.
Yeah, I think it's very important. And it's the flip side to what I said about the conflict half an hour ago, when I said the conflict was directly shaped and is in some ways an outcome of European history. the Jews who fled from Europe due to anti-Semitism and then later Nazism, but also colonialism that shaped the Arab world in mostly problematic ways. And we still see the results. So, you know, I've stressed this, but you can also then look at how this affects the different Europeans who have no direct relation to family. You know, they're not Jewish or they're not Arab or Palestinian, but they are involved in some strange ways that they're not always conscious of. So we shouldn't approach ourselves to claim, oh, we are just, you know, bystanders and we're just observing objectively from the side how these two groups are attacking each other. I think actually we are in the battle itself. We are in the conflict. We are addressed. We are conscious of our involvement in some cases. Our history is part of it, and we are emotionally involved. I see this a lot in Germany. There is an understandable, but at times also problematic sentiment in many German, not all, of course, not by far not all, but in segments of the German society that have a sympathy for Zionism and that have a sympathy for Israel and a sympathy for Jews due to what Germany has done and what Germans have done in the Nazi past. So there is an emotional involvement that make it very painful at times for Palestinians to be confronted with, because they're not in the picture then. So what I'm trying to say is that, and I think that would work for Norway in complicated ways that I don't understand, but I see it in England, for example, that, you know, colonialism and our past shape how we are emotionally involved in this and how we approach it in complex ways. So we need to consider this. I don't know that I'm not suggesting that we all do therapy, but we have to be conscious of our own involvement and emotions in this.
I think that brings us very close to the end now. Still, we haven't received any further questions, but I have saved one question as a final question, which is, how is it possible to get the world not to blame Jews in general for the actions of the Israeli government? Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean that would be that is close to the question: how could we get rid of anti-Semitism? I think it's very difficult in many ways, and the conflict, as much as it's intensified and gets more problematic, it also becomes it becomes an engine for anti-Semitism and for racism in ways that I think are deeply problematic and harmful. So I'm not very optimistic that there will be an end to blame Jews in general for the actions of the Israeli state. But I think one important way is to try to make distinctions. So Jews are not the same as the Israeli government. Jews are not, all the same. There are a very complex group of people that actually infights a lot over these issues. So we need to understand this, and then we may be able to do less blaming. But at the same time, I'm afraid, the intensification of the conflict currently doesn't help to destroy this. So it might be difficult to get somewhere with this. But I think evaluation, considering the context, assessing what we do, looking at our own language, looking at our own concepts, looking at microaggression and macroaggression. All this can help if it really helps us to overcome it. I'm not sure in the long run, maybe, hopefully, one day. The solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would also help, but I'm not very hopeful in that regard either, to be honest.
Yeah, but meanwhile, it seems that we are left to try to practice and improve the double task to acknowledge emotions and to see that emotions are a very important part of this, but still strive to do these intellectual exercises of making distinctions, not putting things or conflating things and keeping things as complex as they are.
Yeah, and then maybe a final point, because often people do a distinction that I don't like, a distinction between our emotional life and our cognitive intellectual life. And in some ways, your words just use this, which is fine. We do this all the time. But look, I do think that our mind and our cognitive life can influence and have influence on our emotional life. So if we practice trying to understand better the intricate parts of the conflict, if we practice our speaking about this, I do think that we are affecting our emotions. I'm not saying we can change them from one day to the next, but we can reflect on why we have them, when we have them, and maybe we can affect them and have them in less aggressive ways. That would be nice. But I think there is a connection. We often say, these are separate things. I have my emotions, they overwhelm me, and then I'm just angry about the other side. Well, we produce anger also. We produce the hatred in some ways. And if we produce it, then it's harder to get rid of it. But if we try to understand that we did produce it, we could work on it. And hopefully get out of the hatred again. But yeah, I'm not terribly optimistic. But I think there is a connection between language and our emotions that we can use to get to a better place.
Thank you, Uffa. I think that was a very, very nice final word. So thank you everyone who participated in this session, and thank you again, Uffa Jensen.